My grandfather was an entrepreneur, which he was, and he had a small business. And I remember sort of sitting around the dinner table, what have you, and he was sort of, this was in the 80s, and he was sort of very pro what Thatcher was doing. I was looking for a vehicle that could actually make the case that business is a force for good. I like the fact that in Trump you have a president who is willing to make decisions. I think too often now political leaders basically get into office and don't get in with a clear plan. The brakes were coming off in terms of government spending and taxation.
So look, can I first of all welcome all of you to the second in our series called Entrepreneurial Minds. It is with Lord Kamall. I don't try and use my title too much, but anyone who knows Nigel Adams from the Buckingham Enterprise Innovation Unit insisted we use Lord Kamall because he thought it would sell more or get more people on seats. And in this series, that's organised in partnership, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Vincent Centre at the University of Buckingham, the Buckingham Enterprise Innovation Unit. I will get there, I promise. We're in partnership. We've organised this series because what we want to do is have conversations with entrepreneurs. Different types of entrepreneurs, understand their motivation, what got them started, some of the issues they face. The last one we had at Buckingham 2 weeks ago was with Mario Peters, who set up Oxford International Colleges. And he told us that he'd started off as a research scientist and he was actually a rocket scientist. So you couldn't make that joke about it. It's not rocket science. And he accidentally ended up setting up a tutorial college and made lots of money and sold it. Never intended to get there. We have a number of other entrepreneurs lined up in this series. We will alternate between University of Buckingham, Vincent Centre, and here at the IA London. But that's enough about the series. I want to thank Lord Matthew Elliott, for being our guest today. And what we do, we have a conversation, and then I'll open it up to the audience. But it really is about understanding entrepreneurship. Maybe you can match some of it to the theory, those of you who are Austrian economists, and think about what people like Israel Kurzner have written about entrepreneurial alertness. But also some of you will be budding entrepreneurs yourself who may want some tips. Just before I start, can I just ask, are there any people who would describe themselves as entrepreneurs now in the audience? Very good. Anyone who is a budding entrepreneur, who is a wannabe entrepreneur? That's great. So all of you just want a warm place on an October evening. And then that's fine, because who knows, we might make you into entrepreneurs in your own right, and you could create lots of money, and then you could pay the IA, and they would be very grateful. Thank you for that. Yeah, two people who agree with me. So over to Matthew. Let me start with you, because when people think of entrepreneurs, they think of people who start companies, make lots of money, sell on, and then maybe become venture capitalists later on and move on. You're a different type of entrepreneur. You're a policy entrepreneur, and you set up a number of organizations over the years. And just as so people are aware, Matthew set up the Taxpayers Alliance. He was a co-founder of Big Brother Watch. He's a campaign director and CEO of No to AV. He was founder and CEO of Business for Britain. He was founder and editor at large of Brexit Central, and he's now co-founder and president of the Jobber Foundation. It's not just one organisational campaign organisation, but a whole number over time. But let's go right back to the beginning. What was that stage or that moment that you realised, I need to set up, or I'm going to set up my first organisation? I'm going to set up the Taxpayers Alliance. Tell me about what was going through your mind when you made that decision.
There's actually one step before the Taxpayers Alliance, and that was at the London School of Economics. And I turned up to Freshers' Fair, and I saw a mutual friend of lots of people here in the room, Alistair Heath, behind the stand, and trying to recruit people for the High Society, and he got me interested. And he got me involved, and they had a magazine called Amaji, which is the oldest word for liberty. And he got me selling adverts. So literally my sort of first week down in London, I was sort of going around the shops and cafes and bookshops near LSE and Aldwych, basically trying to sell adverts for this magazine. So in a sense, for that moment, I sort of had the idea of setting up these groups and being involved in this area. But it was after university, I'd worked very briefly in the House of Commons and European Parliament. And I saw the need. This was sort of 2001. So basically, end of the first Blair term, into the second term, the brakes were coming off in terms of government spending and taxation. And it's fair to say that nobody was really pushing back in a big way against those big tax and spending rises. And I saw the need for a taxpayer group in the UK. I'd read about them in the US and followed the work of people like Grover Norquist from America's Tax Reform and groups like the National Taxpayers Union and Citizens Against Government Waste was in the big one. So I was aware of these groups and I thought that the UK needed a similar group, so started setting one up.
And you say, I mean, it sounds easy. Oh, I decided I'd set one up. And how do you actually go about that process? Where did you start? And what were you doing at the time? And the sort of risks you took, as it were?
So at the time when I set it up with Alistair was involved and a few other people, Andrew Allen, I was actually still working in the partly in the European Parliament, partly in Parliament. So we did it as volunteers, and we had the idea for Taxpayers Alliance. We bought the domain, and this is still very early days of the internet. And I was still working as a researcher. So there's an area downstairs in Parliament. I don't know who knows Parliament down here, but there's a place called the Dungeon, which is basically under the main chamber near the canteen. It always really stinks down there. It's near the canteen. And it's basically where there was a big secretarial pool. And my desk was there as a young researcher. And they used to have telephone boxes towards the end. So everything was by telephone. And of course, we would jump into these boxes to take calls and that sort of thing. So I've been in there as a researcher, researching on behalf of an MP and an MEP, and then ducking into these phone boxes to basically take calls on behalf of the Taxpayers Alliance and place quotes about government waste. Right in there.
And I mean, and did you have the support, or did your bosses at the time, maybe you can confess now, did they know you were doing this? Did you have their support, or were you doing this effectively in your own time?
You know Timothy Kirkhope very well. He sort of half knew what was going on. He knew somebody was emerging, but it was in the public domain. But we needed to get in the public domain to basically be able to then convince people that a group was needed. Because we needed some collateral. We needed a launch. We had our first bumper book of government waste, which we published. And we had the luck, I didn't really know the media in a big way, but we sent out a press release on a Sunday. And I soon learned this was a great day to send it out. It was first thing in the morning. And Trevor Kavanagh, who was the political editor of The Sun at the time, called us up. I thought, great, this is going to go on page 2. Anyway, big story on page 2 of The Sun, big sort of Sun Says leader. And Patience Wheatcroft, who was then the business editor of The Times, also picked up the story for her column. And from that, we started having a bit of credibility with the media and started doing more press releases and more examples of government waste. And once we collected those examples together and had a bit of a sort of strategy plan about what we were going to do, I then sent this off to a group of people to try and track funding. And again, at that point, I didn't really know many donors to organisations.
Let's stop you there. So when you launched, were you still volunteers on no money, effectively?
Correct.
Right. And okay, carry on.
So Andrew Allen, who was our chairman, had put some seed money into it as a partner at LAK. So he was really, really helpful in the beginning, hugely. But we were all volunteers essentially, and it was just for minimal costs. But then we sent out the strategy plan, as we grandly called it, to basically the Business for Sterling mailing list. And as you remember, there was a group called Business for Sterling. This was the early 2000s. Basically, they were fighting against Britain joining the euro. And very cleverly, they did adverts in newspapers with 500 or 1,000 business leaders all signed up, all who were against the euro. So their names were in the public domain. And we basically collected a mailing list from that by sort of literally just writing them at their companies. And Andrew Allen was also a signatory to Business of Britain, then the No campaign. So you could write them sort of with that hat on tangentially. And we got some meetings. And from that mailing, we basically raised enough money for me to go full time. We had about 3 months' money in the bank of salary, sort of low side of the one previously, but 3 months' money in the bank. And I sort of thought with that runway, that was enough sort of runway to actually go full time and make a job of it. And from that point, started doing more fundraising, started to expand the team.
Now, this is interesting. To tell us a bit about numbers, how many people did you, if you remember, how many people did you write to? how many of those gave you meetings and how many of those gave you money? Just to show sometimes that how many hoops or actually how wide you have to go in order to attract your first bit of funding.
We probably wrote to about, from memory, 250 people. From that list, some basically just wrote checks. It was quite humbling actually to sort of see people write checks to an organisation and have confidence that it would hopefully take off.
Yes.
And that would be sort of 2 or 3 people. Then we had meetings with half a dozen others. I remember my first meeting with the treasurer of Business Sterling, who was Stanley Combs, who of course was in the House of Lords with us. And, great man. And he got me into Dixon's, the Dixon's headquarters in Mayfair. And I was in there. We had our sort of quite sort of scrappy strategy plan and basically sort of business cards printed out from Call Quick, if that's still around. And so very sort of basic business cards. And he said, oh, you need better business cards than this. And he sort of showed me his sort of really thick business card. And it was all that sort of stuff about you having the right branding and that sort of thing. But he was also one of our sort of early supporters. And I think gradually over time, so we got seed money from that by proving ourselves, by having more success in terms of getting stories in the newspapers and exposing government waste and being a sort of commentator on TV and radio. People could see the niche for what we were doing. And in some ways, we were sort of reinventing what the think tanks were doing, because thinking back to this was sort of 2004, 5. At that point, if you came to, the IEA does brilliant media now and, massively well on YouTube and the mainstream media, what have you. But if you went back to the IEA then, or the Centre for Policy Studies, or indeed the Adam Smith Institute, it wasn't as proactively getting media as they do now.
Yes.
So literally us having no office, but having basically a burner phone with the number on the website, which journalists would call any time of day or night, be able to get through to basically me and be willing to give a quote or go on TV or go on the radio, had that accessibility to a free market, low tax, low spending voice. And it's sort of revolutionized how sort of free market groups in the UK did things.
And when I speak to entrepreneurs, they talk about a few things that they need to line up. One was obviously some money, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The second one was just advice or mentorship.
Yeah.
Did you have any particular people you spoke to? You mentioned some organizations in the States, or did you contact some of those other taxpayer groups to ask them for their model or ask them for advice? Who did you turn to?
Absolutely. So I'd say the sort of went to the States and was able to meet up with Grover Norquist, who was very generous with his time. I was like sort of in my early 20s, but he took me out for a breakfast, then took me along to his Wednesday meeting and got me to present, even though there was nothing to actually present really, but was really encouraging for what I was doing. I would say that a mistake I made at that point was actually seeing all the different taxpayer groups in the States and actually trying to do all their ideas at once and not really sort of specializing in any one thing. But soon, within sort of 6 months to a year, we were basically going really hard on the sort of government waste angle and building that out before we then later on down the line did more things on taxation and the different types of tax models and that sort of thing. So we soon started specializing. So the US was important. Also, Andrew Allen, our chairman, was hugely important as well. He was in his perhaps early 30s at the time, but having worked professionally at LEK, had that sort of good gravitas and good sort of management experience and project management in particular. So he was a really brilliant help in terms of, sort of setting up the TPA, getting advice from people like Alistair Heath, who of course was in the media at the time. I think he was the economics editor of The Business at the time. So he was great advice for getting to the media. So yes, I was able to call on various people.
Just shows it's very important, entrepreneurs. A sum of money, advice, but then you've got to make that decision. Having been a volunteer at another job, you had 3 months money in the bank, you said.
Yes.
Some people say that's a risk. What was your, did you have any dependents or family or partners at the time or,
I was unmarried. So I had a partner, but unmarried. No dependents.
Right. Yeah. And what made you, you may not be able to answer this, but what made you feel comfortable at 3 months? I can live with that risk, I may not get any more money or actually, I believe in myself enough because I've got 3 months. How do you make that decision?
I saw the demand in the market. So from the first mailings, the response we got from them, I could see that people liked the idea. I could see there was a need for it. Interestingly, on the day we launched, I happened to be at a Conservative Party ball and invited on as a guest somebody, and it was Michael Howard's first ball as party leader at the time. I was introduced to him by Rachel Whetstone, and his advice to me was basically, "This is great, and good luck for the Taxpayers Alliance, but keep your independence." And actually, quite smartly, he sort of knew it was more effective as an organisation, not being a Conservative Party group, which he never was, but being independent and being willing to actually make the case for free markets and low tax and low spending, regardless of who's in the office.
Yes. And did you find, I mean, you said this about, because of course, historically, people have thought the IA is a classical liberal organisation.
Yeah.
But people have associated it with the Conservatives. But of course, they've had liberals, they've had Labour people who have been supporters, because finding strands of classical liberalism. Were you able to find people on other parts of the political spectrum at the time who also felt that that there shouldn't be this government waste? That you were able to find people who were Conservatives?
Well, at the time, of course, within the Conservative Party, they were going through that phase of basically matching Labour's spending plans. And this basically happened right up until the financial crisis. And of course, there's that whole phrase of, sharing the proceeds of growth. And it was all about sort of matching Brown's spending plans and being very clever in trying to sort of mimic what Ken Clarke did in matching, what Gordon Brown did in matching Ken Clarke's spending plans in the 90s. And that was seen to be the clever thing to do and the means to get back in. So actually, within the Conservative Party, we were putting out as many quotes against the position of the Conservatives as we were bashing, Gordon Brown as Chancellor.
Yeah. And you said it's 3 months. It's very interesting because everyone's got a sort of different level of risk, as it were. Some people would. I mean, I remember when I went self-employed, I had 12 months in the bank.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is cutting out all my other spending, all the stuff that you don't need to do, all the memberships things. But we felt we had 12 months, and I felt comfortable with that. But you felt comfortable with 3 months. Is that because, as you say, you just sort of demanded, you thought, I want a winner here? What makes you feel comfortable with 3 months? That's what I'm trying to work out here. I mean, maybe I'm just being over the top about it,
It's interesting. It did feel like a risk at the time. And I was sort of being lured into other jobs. Quite a senior shadow cabinet member was trying to get me on board as chief of staff at the time. But I felt it was something I wanted to do. I've always been more motivated by policy rather than party politics. So it seemed like a natural path to go down.
And so you've set up the Taxpayers Alliance.
Yeah.
You've got money in the bank.
Yeah.
Tell me about the early days, now that you've made that jump, as it were. Was it plain sailing? Was it the money just coming in? Were there difficult times? Just tell us about the early days of running an organisation like that.
So I'm pleased to say that we've always met payroll. Any organisation I've done, we've always met payroll for everybody except me. So there were some months when I didn't go with pay, but everybody else got paid at the end of the month, which is a great thing. So I'm pleased with that. So it was sort of touch or go.
Yeah.
And then I can't remember which year it was, but in about 2005, I got TB. So I just launched this thing and got TB and was basically at home and sort of recovering from TB and all that sort of stuff, and still having all these sort of mouths to feed in the sense of hand-raised money. So that was quite a tough time.
Yeah.
But we got through. It was just hard work and determination.
The other challenge I know, having been through this myself, but others as well, is you can be a sole trader or someone on your own.
Yeah.
But actually it's employing that first person and all the laws you have to sort of jump through, and the suspicion of HMRC. And
yeah.
I remember I went, HMRC did courses for self-employed people. I remember I went on 2 courses, and I asked one question, I got 2 different answers. And I thought, oh my goodness, what do I do? But I was scared of taking on the first employee. And I never did in the end. I just worked with consultants. Did you have problems sort of becoming an employer as opposed to someone on your own, if that makes sense?
So we expanded fairly quickly. And the first person we took on was somebody to help out with the admin and the sort of fundraising side of the operation. And I then did most of the research as well as sort of lead the organisation. And then we had an intern, paid fairly, but not a huge amount. And then we started having sort of policy directors. But I always slightly went for having admin, sort of fundraising people ahead of sort of building a huge research team.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, if you're not paying the bills, you won't continue as an organisation. So I've always sort of made sure that the core of the organisation, in terms of the funding and the admin and the accounts and everything like that, is really sort of solidly run, and then additively on to the rest of that.
But how much time did it take for you, though? Because you obviously want to get out there, you want to get your stories out there, you want to get new funders, you want to grow. How much time does it take you just managing employees on a day-to-day basis? Or did you have, did it kind of manage itself, or did you ask an accountant to do all that for you? How did you manage all that sort of payroll?
So basically, I've always found with all the organisations, half your time is spent fundraising as a leader organisation, always. And then another huge chunk of time is basically spent on managing the team. I've never been, I've always been happy for somebody else to do all the media. That's never been my sort of forte. So I had a string of really, really good campaign directors, people like Mark Wallace was fantastic, Susie Swire, Andy Sylvester was for a while, people like that who are fantastic at actually talking to the media, but also appearing on TV. We had some great research directors as well, and I was always quite particular in terms of how research was presented and the accuracy of the data and the thoroughness of the data. But in terms of writing it up, I was happy for people to take a lead on that. And I've never always really wanted to be sort of front and center organizations. I've never really wanted to be the chief spokesman, particularly. I've always been happy for other people to do that. So having that sort of mixed role of basically being the number one fundraiser and also the manager, if you like, has always come quite naturally.
And you're growing an organisation, you're learning as you go along, not only to run the organisation, but also how to do your role, but also how to grow it.
Yeah.
Do you have still have mentors or people you can turn to at that stage?
So Andrew Allen was still really important, and has been throughout my career in a huge, huge way. Funny enough, another person who is perhaps familiar to different people in the room, Patrick Barber, who's been involved in quite a few different think tanks in Westminster, who very, very sadly died earlier this year. But he made his money and his fortune with something called the Barber Index. This was in the 70s and 80s. And basically, it was before you'd have everything online, and it was like an architectural catalogue, and you'd have the inserts which were put in with the latest sort of things, building materials, what have you. So he made his money. So he was always very particular about not only presentation, because that was basically a presentation job, but also in terms of basically management. And he had a very decentralized management structure with very clear objectives for people, checked in on a regular basis, about monthly. And he sort of taught me actually my sort of management technique, which I sort of still use to this day in terms of how I manage the team.
So it's critical to have someone that you can turn to and talk
Absolutely,
to.
100%.
Yeah. And you've so tell us about, because you've done a lot of other organisations. I also want to open up to the floor. Tell us about that journey with Taxpayers Alliance, and then the next one was Big Brother Watch. Is that right?
Next one was Big Brother Watch. I was still doing Taxpayers Alliance, but I did Big Brother Watch. Big issue at the time of the ID cards thing was still rumbling along. CCTV was becoming a big issue.
And how big was Taxpayers Alliance at that stage?
At that point, probably 10 employees.
And did you take employees from Taxpayers Alliance to set up Big Brother Watch, or something completely different?
Completely new.
Right.
Separate company, separate team. The founding director was Alex Dean. Dylan Sharp was his first comms director, who went to me with Business for Britain and No to AV, and we still keep in touch. Good friend. So it's a separate team.
And was that easier for you? You said, okay, I've done this now, I'll use the same template. I've made some mistakes along the way, or I've learned from the first organisation. Was that relatively easy for you, or were there surprises?
It was easier. What I learned from that experience, I still love Big Brother Watch, and by the way, I'm really proud that, for what it's worth, that both Taxpayers Alliance and Big Brother Watch are still going strong. I've had nothing to do with them for 10 years, basically, but still going strong and great organisations. What I learned from that was basically not to do too many things at once, in the sense of it actually dilutes your brand.
Yeah.
So actually, from an external point of view, people get confused. Are you doing Taxpayers Alliance, or are you doing Big Brother Watch? What's the relationship between the two of them? And I'd say during that part of my career, I started doing a few too many things. and diluting that to becoming slightly unfocused. But now I try and sort of keep to.
And then did you realise at the time? So was there a point when you said, "Okay, I'm now going to be Mr. Big Brother Watch. I'm no longer going to be Taxpayers Alliance"? Was there a point you did that, or you still juggle the two at the same time?
No, I was in my sort of the arrogant 30s and sort of empire building and sort of building lots of organisations and rolling things out.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, that may be a jerky comment, but did you want to build an empire? Did you want to be a sort of a magnate of campaign organisations? Did you have a long-term plan anywhere at the time?
I really enjoyed campaigning, and I could see needs for different organisations, and I wanted those to be fulfilled.
Right.
I wasn't bothered about getting the sort of credit for it, so I was happy for other people to run them, but I wanted them to exist.
And next one, if I'm correct, it was No to AV. Is that correct?
So No to AV. So this was after the 2010 general election. David Cameron asked Rodney Leach to basically find somebody to run the AV referendum campaign. If you remember, after the 2010 election, there was lots of disquiet amongst the Conservatives, and you had a rump of people who were unhappy about the coalition with the Lib Dems, and it was that group of people who were sort of setting up a sort of nascent no campaign. And I think that Cameron wanted to sort of squelch that. So basically asked Rodney to set up something separate, and Rodney asked me to do it. And then the first priority there was basically, how do we make it, to your point earlier, cross-party? And this was summer of 2010. Think about it, sort of Labour out of office, leadership election, the one with the Ed Miliband won, but it was against sort of Ed Balls and the like. And all the leadership contenders had been yes to AV. But we managed to recruit a hardcore of Labour supporters who were on the no side, including the likes of John Prescott and John Reid and David Blunkett and Margaret Beckett and Charlie Falconer. So some quite sort of big Labour figures. I wanted to have that core of Labour figures sort of signed up, including a few ex-Labour MPs who came on board as campaigners, Jane Adey, Jane Ryan. We had that core Labour group. I went into number 10 to speak to, who was it? Kate Fall and Stephen Gilbert, now colleagues of ours. And they said, how's it all going, sort of thing. And I said, well, I've got this core of Labour group sort of willing to work with us on the no campaign. It's great news. And their comment was basically, what does that mean for the coalition? So I think they expected the no campaign to be basically a flop, and they weren't that invested in it. It was basically 2-1 in favour of AV. They knew it could disrupt the coalition. They didn't particularly want to sort of defend first past the post in a big way. So once there was actually a serious Labour presence within the AV referendum campaign, we were able to say, well, we need some serious Conservatives.
Yes.
So basically that's where we recruited the likes of William Hague and Saeed Avazi as party chairman at the time, and Michael Howard, if you remember that.
And when you did that, did you walk away from Big Brother Watch? I don't mean that in a negative way, and from Taxpayers Alliance. Did you, or had you already left there? What were you? How did you manage those two organisations, as it were?
So Big Brother Watch sort of ran itself.
Right.
Alex was extremely good. So that ran itself, and TPA. I'm probably going to get the chronology wrong. I'm sorry if I do, but Matt Sinclair had come up as research director, and then I think he came on board as director at the time, and basically took over the running for the 8 months of the campaign.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting what you said. So let's just get this clear. Number 10 were not particularly too happy.
No.
That you had recruited some Labour people.
Yeah.
And did you recruit the Labour people, or did you get a Labour ally to recruit the Labour people? How do you go about, some of these, Taxpayers Alliance, some Labour people will be suspicious of you. How did you manage to build that coalition to get Labour people on board?
So one of my early hires for No to AB was Peter Botting, who some people may know, who's very gregarious, Tory, but basically can get on with anybody. And he was instrumental in basically getting the meetings. But of course, a whole bunch of meetings where you, of course, had to turn up as campaign director and CEO, and Pete speaking to trade unionists and sort of trying to get them on board. And so quite free conversations.
Yes.
But basically, they were pleased that there was a campaigner on board who sort of knew how to run campaigns rather than allowing to go to Rod.
And so you obviously win the campaign. What was the number 10's response to that?
Well, they came on board sort of quite late in the day. So basically, we had the Labour folk on board from October. We then managed to get some Tory folk on board. They didn't really fundraising was quite tough because it was seen to be quite an obscure issue, and frankly, CCHQ weren't really sort of signaling to people to get involved in the funding side of things. This was a sort of bigger operation, of course, so you had to raise sort of really significant sums for it. So actually, around the time of sort of January, February, it was sort of quite a tough situation, sort of trying to keep the show on the road. In the sense, the Labour guys thought we'd have all the money, and we were trying to sort of raise the money as fast as we could. But eventually, they came round, and I think Cameron realised from the strength of feeling from his backbenchers how importantly they thought it was to keep first past the post, that he had to get involved. So from that point, from about sort of March time, fundraising became easier. David Cameron got involved. John Reid got involved in a big way. And then towards the end, there was quite a famous sort of press conference where it was sort of David Cameron, John Reid, sort of showing that sort of strength of unity between the Conservatives and mainstream Labour on all of this. And with having sort of really senior Labour folk involved, it basically gave permission for Labour voters to vote no, even though their leader, Ed Miliband, was on the yes side.
Very interesting. And then you go from there to talk about business in Britain and vote leave. How were you asked? Did you decide, actually, I really need to set up an organisation like this? Another need. There's not enough people talking about this. Tell me about that decision making and how you got involved with both of those.
So post No to AV, I sort of had caught the referendum bug in a sense, and I'd always been a long-term Eurosceptic and written a book on European waste, and of course being involved in the European Parliament and sort of met you there for the first time. So I'd always had that interest in sort of the European issue, and this is coming along. This is the time of the sort of Eurozone crisis, and sort of Greece is going belly up, and I think the Economist did their first front page where they coined the term Brexit, or used Brexit on the front page for the first time. So the idea of Britain leaving the EU is becoming a very live issue. And it struck me as a very sensible thing that basically you needed an organisation who was willing to begin to sort of make the case in that direction. Perhaps not Brexit from day one, but begin to make the case for a change in relationship with the EU. And I tried to get Rodney Leach involved because, of course, he was the grandfather of all of this, and he'd set up Business of Sterling and the No campaign and really saw the importance of having business people making the economic case. He didn't want to be involved. And because he had the Open Europe think tank and he was very happy with that, and that's quite close to the Cameron administration, and he didn't want to have a sort of disruptor on his hands. So I set up BFB, and it very soon got legs. We launched it. We said it before, but it basically launched after the Bloomberg speech, and with 200 names in an advert in, I think it was City AM, and sort of built out from there. We made sure from the outset we had a sort of Labour chair and a Conservative chair, and we sort of tried to keep it sort of cross-party, and we had, what else? We sort of basically made it referendum focused. It was all about sort of campaigning for the referendum when that was going through in a big way. And we talked about, having change within the EU, and basically the change we wanted was the change that David Cameron had outlined in his Bloomberg speech, which was quite high. It was quite a significant change. So we would be happy with that. So we had to jump over that barrier. So we sort of held him to account on that. And it built out in the years from 2013 to 2015. By the end, it had about sort of 1,500 business leaders signed up, regional campaigns in different parts of the country. And it basically became the financial backbone for Vote Leave when it transitioned to the Vote Leave campaign.
Tell me about that transition. I mean, was that the referendum's been called, let's try and be the official No campaign, is it? Campaign, a Leave campaign. Tell me about that transition.
Well, we'd started sort of thinking about a referendum, and in 2014, when it was the European elections where the UKIP came number one for the first time, I think it was then, I'd commissioned Dominic Cummings to do a whole bunch of research and polling and focus groups both before and after the European elections to really find out what was driving public opinion at the time. So we had a really good idea of where public opinion was, and some of the ideas about taking back control and came from that piece of research. But in the election, neither of us particularly thought that the Conservatives were going to win. We thought it'd be either Ed Miliband in government or probably another coalition. So i.e. there wouldn't be a referendum. So it took us both by surprise to a certain extent when Cameron got in with his majority. And then it was sort of game on for the referendum. And it was then a matter of sort of changing gear into transitioning Business of Britain into Vote Leave. And of course, we were basically a renegotiated organisation rather than a Leave organisation. So managing that transition was tricky.
Did you lose people
made easily? We lost a few people, but basically it was made easier by the fact that in July of that year, 2015, David Cameron basically said, the EU said, there'd be no treaty change. And as you would know from being an MEP, without treaty change, you couldn't get the sort of change they were talking about within the Bloomberg speech.
Yes.
So from that point, most people came with us. Some people peeled away. Stuart Rose peeled away and went on to head up the Remain campaign, Stronger In. Charlie Mullins peeled away, and he's gone sort of from Leave to Remain to Leave to Remain to Leave now, so back and forth all the time. But we lost a few people, but the vast majority stuck with us.
And there was no guarantee when the referendum was called that you were going to be the official Leave campaign, was there? And you were battling against, I think, Nigel's outfit.
Yeah.
What was that called?
In the Know was the first version, then Leave.eu, and then Grassroots Out.
Yeah, and how do what's your thinking about how do we make sure that we are the official campaign? What did you have to go through for that?
So this is the closest thing the UK's ever had to a US primary, where of course in the US you have, some people know about this. So in the US, of course, you have candidates on both sides, campaigning to be the nominee for their party. And it was really like that in the sense of both of us were sort of tearing strips out of each other and sort of vying to be the main designated campaign for a referendum that neither of us knew when the date would be or when the designation would happen. So it was quite sort of personal, difficult time. Looking back on it now, I actually think it was all for the good, in the sense that imagine a scenario where there hadn't been Leave.eu or Aaron Banks's campaign set up. We would have been left with the dilemma, what do you do about Nigel Farage? And you couldn't really sort of set up a Leave campaign without having Nigel involved in some way. So as it worked out, with UKIP and Nigel having their own campaign, and setting up Vote Leave, which then had the likes of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Gisela Stuart, what have you, you then essentially had the sort of core Vote Leave campaign and the more mainstream, sort of moderate sort of Vote Leave campaign, appealing to the centre ground of people who are yet to make up their minds, who perhaps in their heart want to leave the EU, but had questions about the economics and want to sort of see where Boris is going to land and all those sort of things. They didn't want to feel they were voting for UKIP and Nigel Farage by both voting Leave. So having a more mainstream campaign with Boris and really helped us.
And so next to, I'm going to try and squeeze this so I can open up for floor. Sorry, I've spoken too much. The Brexit Central, you won the referendum campaign. Why did you feel the need for Brexit Central?
Basically to ensure that the referendum was delivered, to keep people informed about it. It's funny, Brexit Central. Yeah, I'm really pleased to set it up. It did a great job. Particularly Jonathan Isby did a great job as editor and Georgiana Bristol as MD. I was never employed by it, but it did a fantastic job. I was sort of searching for sort of roles in the corporate sector at the time, not having much success with the sort of Brexit backlash or what have you, but it did a fantastic job. And we sort of called an end to it in January 2020, where we thought we left the EU.
Last one, Jobs Foundation, where you are now.
Yeah.
What was the thinking behind that? What was the need you saw out there to set up the Jobs Foundation?
I could see in 2021 how the UK was turning increasingly anti-business and anti-enterprise. And I was looking for a vehicle that could actually make the case that business is a force for good. And I did a whole lot of market research in 2021, trying to find out what people liked about business. And it turned out what they wanted from business was, number one, of course, high quality goods at a reasonable price, what have you. That's the number one thing, of course. But then they liked the fact that businesses provide jobs, provided opportunity for people through training, and pay tax. They were the key things that they liked about business. And you didn't have any business groups talking about this. This is the time in 2021, 22, which was the height of it, was sort of peak woke, if you want to use those terms. And that was the big sort of theme of the business community in their sort of corporate comms. Nobody was talking about the actual sort of role of business, what it actually practically does for society in a way that chimes with people, making that case. I sort of saw a need for a business group in that way, with jobs being the number one thing that people liked. Jobs Foundations all grew out of that. And we launched 2 years ago. We're now up to 1,300 people signed up. Starting regional campaigns, Northeast, Southwest, Yorkshire launching very soon. Have some sort of serious publications in terms of jobs and the whole sort of welfare to work piece, which is really important and really crucial from a business point of view, but also doing some policy around that in terms of looking into things like the rise in employers' NI or the Employment Rights Bill and the things that affect jobs as a whole. But we're halfway formed. There's a long way to go in terms of forming us, but we still grow.
And if that you've got John Mendelsohn from the Labour benches on the board, so you've once again gone cross-party on this for the more pro-business people in the Labour Party.
Cross-party, and for the first time ever, a charity. It's the first charity I've set up.
Right. And so, and if people want to know more, I think there are copies of Job Foundation. Is that your brochure or whatever it is? Or
it's on your seats.
On your seats. So please read more. I have to ask you this question before I open it up to the audience, which is this. You're a policy entrepreneur. You set up all these wonderful campaign organisations. Have you ever thought about setting up a business for yourself to make lots of money? And why have you never done that as opposed to just set up all these policy organisations?
I think the most natural business to set up would be basically some sort of PR shop or sort of lobbying shop. And I've never liked the idea of being a gun for hire. I've always picked the campaigns I wanted to do rather than sort of have a big corporate come along and say, well, you campaign on this for me. So I never liked that from that point of view. I love the fact that I'm now senior advisor and NED to various businesses, and it's often businesses going through scale-ups. And of course, having done 2 referendum campaigns and set up multiple groups, that sort of scaling up is a sort of key skill I have, and help with their comms and what have you in their strategy. So I love doing that, but I wouldn't want to sort of set up like a sort of PR shop.
There are some people who actually, they're entrepreneurs. They can be entrepreneurial in another organisation, but they don't want to do all the rest. So look, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes. Can I just get an indication of how many people would like to ask a question, just so how strict I'm going to be on time, as it were? Okay, so I've got 2 here and 2 there. Do you want to take them individually or in threes? How would you prefer to take them?
Individually.
Individually, okay. But young man there, please introduce yourself as well, and then ask some question.
So I'm Brendan Fist. About sort of jobs, I was recently, of course,
Oh, sorry, I should have realised, sorry. Start again, please, sorry.
I'm Brendan Amfist, recent graduate from Durham University. I just wanted to ask about Starmer's Employment Rights Bill and how that sort of detriments the flexibility in the labour market. And what do you think are some bad things there, good things there? What's your take on Starmer's deal?
Okay. I'll talk about the general policy and then come on to the bill specifically. We have a situation in the UK where employment is way below where it was pre-COVID. And to get back to that sort of 80% employment as it was before, you need to get over 2 million people into work. And at the moment, there are currently 700,000 job vacancies. So you have a gap there of 1.3 million jobs, which need to be created by businesses, basically. So you need a really good environment for businesses to be willing to create those jobs. And that means that when you have things like the employers' NI going up, or when you have measures that basically drive entrepreneurs out of the country or disincentivize investment, they're all going against basically businesses thriving and actually setting up more jobs for people. So that's a key thing to think about. On the Employment Rights Bill specifically, we actually just talked about this in the law as well, the votes earlier. In terms of the day one rights, when you think about the people who we want to get into work, we've looked at all sorts of cohorts, whether it's the long-term sick, many younger people finding it more difficult to get into work, or at the other end you have people like ex-offenders or the homeless or other groups like that. A lot of these hires can be trickier hires where companies basically want to find out what an employee is like before fully committing to them. And if you have day one rights, as the Employment Rights Bill potentially brings in, what it'll mean is that lots of companies won't want to actually make these choices of taking sort of risky hires on. We were just here in the house before, would you really want to take on an ex-offender if you're not quite sure how it's going to all work out, or will you poach somebody from a different company? So basically, having these probationary periods is really important to getting people into work. So really with the Employment Rights Bill, to answer your question, it's tying up companies with a lot of red tape. And I think the government's doing it with the best of intentions. I'm not doubting their intentions anyway, but the effect will be that the very people they're trying to help get into work won't get the jobs they want.
Young man there, and then we've got two on this side after.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Brian Nabil. I actually work as Director of Technology Policy at one of the think tanks you had mentioned, National Taxpayers Union Foundation in Washington, D.C. I found it rather interesting that when you were setting up your various policy ventures that you had reached out to various US counterparts and such. So my question is, when you are setting up your venture in the UK, do you find in your conversation and your experience that the challenges of setting up a policy venture in the UK was different to those in the UK, in the US or Brussels for that matter? And have you also found that, because the landscape is rather different, do you find it perhaps more rewarding because perhaps there are not, when you had set it up, there were not as many think tanks and such?
Within the US, it goes without saying there's a lot more money. So there's a lot more private money from foundations, what have you, to go for. And what you can do as a campaign in terms of being a sort of 501c4 or having a 501c3 associated with it, there's a lot more flexibility there in terms of what you can actually do. So things are, I'd say, sort of simpler in some ways in states, and there's more money around. I've never set up anything up in the EU or Brussels, but my understanding there is a lot more sort of rent seeking going on, and EU cash swirling around or corporate cash swirling into these groups. So it's all slightly murky and, sort of astroturfing operations. That's something I'm interested in. I'd say it's more difficult in the UK to actually set things up. There's less money around, but I'd say things have become easier. And if you think back to when I was setting up the Taxpayers Alliance, and of course, the internet had been around, but basically having websites was fairly new. There's no social media. It was all that mainstream media still. Now you can set something up really as an individual and have a huge impact. So if I think about, for example, Darren Grimes, who worked for me at Base Central.
Worked there for a while as well.
Worked here for a while as well. Hugely entrepreneurial. Got a fantastic following on Twitter. He's done a ton of stuff on YouTube as well, I know, and really created a fantastic brand for himself and campaigned on a whole bunch of issues. And I can think of other people like, Charlotte Gill, who does a fantastic Substack looking particularly at government waste and government spending and doing a whole bunch of FOIs like I used to at the Taxpayers Alliance, and uncovering all of that and then placing those stories into the mainstream media and all that sort of stuff that I used to do. And that's basically based on her being an entrepreneur and having a Substack and getting stuff out there in a great way. So I'd say in some ways now with technology, the barriers to entry to doing things are a lot less than they were. It's less costly than it was perhaps in the past.
We've got two on this side. I think Alison, and then there was one other person. Is that Ross? So it's okay. Do go past, okay? Please, over to you.
Hi, my name is Margot. I'm a teaching assistant and I did the IEA Sixth Form programme. I'm really interested by your role in the No to AV campaign because in my mind, liberalism and PR systems coexist really happily because it's about taking power away from established parties and central government. So my question is, were you really personally invested in No to AV? And if so, what were your motivations for doing so? Thank you.
100%. So I like first past the post because it tends to, not always, but tends to deliver governments with the majority in the House of Commons. That means that basically at the end of their time in office, you can actually judge them on what they've achieved. They've got no excuses. They can't sort of say, well, the coalition party didn't allow me to do this, and we wish we could have done it, or what have you. It's very clear, and there's accountability there going on. So that's why I've always had a preference for first past post.
Other questions? Please put your hands up. Sure, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You go first.
Okay, that's okay. Hi guys. Richard Holden, Shadow Secretary of State for Transport. I was over in the States at the start of the summer, and I met the Congressional Budget Office, which genuinely I thought was transformational for my thinking about stuff. If our all Tory MPs/Labour MPs had to put down every amendment was costed, then I think we'd actually face quite a different conversation going on in Parliament. I just wondered what your thoughts were about ensuring that the Commons and Lords both had access to a Congressional Budget Office, and if any amendments hadn't been, or a Parliamentary Budget Office, and if any amendments hadn't gone through it, then they would be treated with the derision in which they deserve.
You make a really, really interesting point. One of the first things I tried to do in copying, we talk about US campaigns and copying US campaigns for the UK, was copying Grover Norquist's tax pledge. And I tried to do this for the 2005 general election. And of course, it doesn't really transpose into a party system like the UK, but you don't have primaries where people can run on the tax pledge and then get the nomination or what have you. You have a system where the central party has huge control in terms of who is selected for candidate seats and what have you. So the party machine has a lot more power. But I love the idea of basically having individual MPs and candidates who are much more independent. I love the idea of basically line by line voting almost on budgets, where you can actually hold your local MP to account for what they vote for.
So Rick, are you going to try to get that into the next Conservative manifesto? See what sort of thing. Okay. Alison, did you want to come in now?
And then I'll hand over to Fraser. I think he wants to go too. But I just wanted to say...
Or introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. My name is Alison Sproul, and I have been an IEA member on and off for quite a long time. But I wanted to also say thank you to the IEA, because I remember them being an early identifier of Matthew's abilities when they put him in 30 Under 30 to watch. So it's you've done well, and thank God for it.
You don't have to answer that. But you can.
The IEA has been superb, and when I came down to to London, and I was involved with the Hiker Society, like I said, and Alistair was there, and Hector Birchwood and people like that. We always used to come along to the IEA, and the IEA was massively generous in terms of not only having sort of pizza evenings and interesting speakers, but also sort of handing out books and actually really helping us as a group with a certain amount of sort of seed funding for sort of small events at the LSE. So they're hugely helpful.
Gentleman back, and then lady up front, please. You first.
I'm Fraser Nelson, columnist at The Times. Matthew, given your knowledge of British and American think tanks, why do you think that theirs, on the right anyway, in the free market side, are just so much bigger and better resourced and more effective than ours? We tend to be pretty good at coming up with a small number of relatively small think tanks, but lack the resource to do modelling, to do the bigger reports, which we see those on the other side of the debate doing in this country. Is there something? Do you think it's a question of funding? Is it a question of ecosystem? Is it just because we're a smaller country, therefore we've got smaller think tanks, or is it just something? And do we have too many entrepreneurs setting up new things? Not enough, consolidation.
I think the US is helped by being, let's face it, a more prosperous country. When I was at the LSE in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had roughly the same GDP per capita as the US. Now it's 4% ahead, so it has more welfare, bigger country. I think a bigger tradition in terms of philanthropy. Individual taxpayers get more bang for the buck in terms of their giving to these organizations, which is a huge benefit as well. But one of the downsides with having scale like they have in the States, you do become more in hoc with your donors and where the donors are going. And I won't name any names in terms of the think tanks over there, but there are think tanks who are solidly free market and would feel very comfortable and aligned with the IEA and classical liberalism of free markets and what have you, who now, with the change in the political mood within the States towards bigger government republicanism, they've sort of and protectionism, they've drifted that way as a movement and as think tank. So it can come in with a downside if you get too big and too reliant on too few big donors.
Why do you think ours haven't been winning the argument very much over the last 10, 15 years? I mean, I'm a director president of Wolsey Studies. I'm, I guess, part of the problem there. But when you look at the things at the eyes, at CBS, Keith Joseph, whoever it is, these ideas are not in the standards. And I'm not quite sure whether you think that's the political mood. There's not much that can be done. And do you have any thoughts on why you started off against the great? Now, yeah, it's even more so.
I think it's trickier for think tanks on the centre right when their party's in government, or indeed the centre left. And in a sense, I had it not lucky, but when I was doing the Taxpayers Alliance and Gordon Brown was his Chancellor and then Prime Minister, we could quite easily sort of tear chunks out of him and talk about his overspending and his wasteful spending or what have you, whilst also, I should say, sort of take strips out of George Osborne as well and talk about what he was doing. When your natural party or your closest party then gets into government, you then have a dilemma as a think tank. Do you basically try and sort of play the inside track and sort of be supportive and play the role of flying kites for the party, for policy ideas, and become a bit of an insider and perhaps get small tweaks through? Or do you remain sort of true and independent on the outside and willing to criticise them when they go wrong? And that's always a dilemma that think tanks have. And I remember looking at the IEA's back catalogue once. I still have this pamphlet at home. From about sort of 1982, there's a pamphlet from the IEA where they tear strips out of the Thatcher government for not being radical enough, for not going far enough. And in a sense, the IEA always has been independent, I think, and all stronger for it.
Yes, yeah, no, and in fact, the IEA is supposed to be about party politics. Yeah, appeal to classical liberals of all parties. Of course, they appealed. I say they because I'm not an employee of the IEA. They appeal different parts of the classical liberal spectrum. So there'll be people who are socially liberal who appeal, who are classical liberal. There'll be people who are economically liberal, fiscally conservative. Lady at the front, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? This will be the final question otherwise. Okay, lady at the front, and then Nigel Adams from the Buckingham Enterprise and Innovation Unit.
I'm Caroline Oldfield. I would love to know...
Any affiliation?
Yeah, I work for LCM on the City Mission. I'd love to know about your values and what drives you, and also a little bit about the impact of the Jobs Foundation so far.
So in terms of the values, if you asked me that question 10 years ago or something, I would have sort of trotted out an answer about basically how my grandfather was an entrepreneur, which he was, and he had a small business. And I remember sort of sitting around the dinner table, what have you, and he was sort of, this was in the 80s, and he was sort of very pro what Thatcher was doing, and that sort of, and my sort of economic thinking sort of came from that. And I still, absolutely massively admire what he did. He's no longer with us now, but that's where my sort of, in a sense, my entrepreneurialism, that entrepreneurial thinking comes from my grandfather. And I remember him debating with my dad, who was a social worker in his professional life. And in the 80s, he was much more centrist. I don't know how he voted. I suspect he voted SDP at times and perhaps Labour at times. I know he was definitely voted Conservative inside as well. But classic sort of floating a vote, but more of a sort of perhaps sort of, I would say Christian socialist. That sounds too socialist, but that sort of school of thinking as somebody who's really good and a really good person and somebody who's doing a massive amount of good in terms of his social work. And actually, I now like to think with Jobs Foundation, it sort of combines the two, in the sense that for my dad, actually learning the importance of actually helping people at the bottom of society, helping them get jobs, which is a value he really believes in, and the importance of work. And it's quite inspiring actually in the Lords, where you hear Labour people being bold enough to stand up and always say, as a Labour Party, it was all about the right to work, not a right to welfare, a right to work. And that's something my dad really believed in a big way. So I sort of combine my sort of grandfather's influence, my dad's influence in terms of that. In terms of the Jobs Foundation's impact, we're sort of halfway through being built. I think what we've done really well in our first 2 years is really actually bring together some of the thinking in terms of the role of business, in terms of getting people into work and providing opportunities for the less fortunate in society, and also done some of the running in terms of the policy side of things, in terms of making sure that businesses are able to thrive and able to employ more people. So I think we're doing some good running in terms of that. In terms of where we go from here, next year, we'll be thinking about having some form of pledge or accreditation scheme to actually recognise employers who do a particularly good job in this area. Because let's face it, if we're going to get people into work, it will only come from the private sector. It won't be in terms of having higher welfare or welfare changes or tweaking job centres or anything like that. It'll be by businesses creating those jobs with those great opportunities, great wages, great training schemes to provide people with those opportunities.
I'm going to give a last question to Nigel Adams from the Buckingham Enterprise Innovation Unit. We did not plan this, I assure you. This is purely spontaneous, isn't it, Nigel?
And you'll expect me to be a renegade, don't you?
No.
Well, I'm going to be one.
Okay.
Number one, I seem a bit like your father, actually. I'm more there than that. I'm extremely pleased of your ability to cross parties. I got 2 points. Number one, the Trump factor. Where are you on Trump?
Where am I on Trump? Did you say 2 questions or was it?
Yeah, the next one's going to be a funny one.
Give him the second one so he can hold the
It's got to be at the end. It's got to be at the end. It's not political.
That's the where I'll fail for the face. In terms of Trump, I'm pro-Trump. Basically, I would 100% vote for Trump over Harris, who would be a disaster without question. I like the fact that in Trump you have a president who is willing to make decisions. I think too often now political leaders basically get into office and are sort of slightly buffeted around and don't get in with a clear plan, as we see with the current lot, and are really sort of pushed around by events without having that clear plan of where they're going. And Trump, I think actually, looking back, history will say that he actually really benefited from losing the last presidential election. So he gave him 4 years to actually think about what he'd do differently and think about what he'd do in terms of policy, in terms of staffing, in terms of how he'd handle Congress and the swamp, as he would call it. And he came in with actually a very clear plan. And those first 100 days, you've barely seen anything like it in US history before in terms of what he achieved. So I like all of that. I'm more of a free trade than he is. He's more comfortable with higher government spending than I am. I hope he uses the lockdown to cut back some of the federal infrastructure in a big way. But generally speaking, I'm a pro-Trump.
I wonder if your dad would have been.
My dad?
It's an immediate intermediate.
Is that your second question?
No.
Okay. The company? No.
No, I'm with him.
Right, Nigel, your second question.
Can I have my question?
Yes, go on.
It's a bit of a funny one to end on a light note.
All right.
Was I right in hearing that you were in the Sun? You got something into the Sun on page 2.
Yes,
Was that in the days when page 3 was an infamous site?
it was.
Brilliant. You got wonderful publicity then. But a lot of these young people here wouldn't know what we're talking about, would they?
We even had, during the early days of the TPA, because the feature on page 3 used to have a speech bubble at the top talking about the news of the day. We have a number of picks where Taxpayers Alliance stories will get you to the speech bubble.
Brilliant. They won't know what we're talking about to all the young people, will it, Ray? We better not tell them.
Right, no, okay, so ladies and gentlemen, before I finish, I just want to thank you all for attending this event tonight. This was the second in the series. We've got a number of future events. And they will be probably alternating between the Vincent Centre at the University of Buckingham and here at the LSE. If you are interested in some of these entrepreneurial events, please do come along. If you've got friends who are budding entrepreneurs and may want to listen to entrepreneurs and learn from them, please come along. If you yourself are an entrepreneur and you wouldn't mind being interviewed, very happy to interview you. Just get in contact with myself or with Nigel Adams over there. I have to do a plug also for the IA. The IA is an educational charity. These events are only possible because of the generous support from donors. So thank you, any donors who are in the audience. But of course, anyone who wants to be a donor to the IA or to the Vincent Centre, you'd be more than welcome. If you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved and support the IA or support us at the Vincent Centre at the University of Buckingham, please talk to we've got Sam at the back and other IA staff who would be happy to tell you about upcoming projects. But for now, can we really show our appreciation for Matthew Elliott? Thank you.